Jeffrey Deskovic didn't confess because he was hiding something. He confessed because he believed honesty would protect him. That belief, that truth will automatically lead to fairness, shaped everything that followed. In 1989, Angela Carrera, a 15-year-old girl, was murdered in Peekskill, New York. The crime shocked the small community and created immediate pressure on investigators to find answers. Angela had been raped, beaten, and strangled. Her body was discovered in a wooded area near Hillcrest Elementary School. The community was terrified, and media coverage was intense. Jeffrey Deskovic was a 16-year-old classmate. He was grieving. He was emotionally affected by the loss, and he soon became a focus of the investigation. Jeffrey had known Angela from school, though they weren't close friends. Like many students, he was disturbed by the violence and wanted to help find the killer. He voluntarily went to police to offer what little information he had, believing his cooperation would be seen as helpful. There was no physical evidence tying Jeffrey to the crime, no DNA, no fingerprints, no witnesses. But investigators noticed something else: his emotional state. He was distraught, he was expressive, he was cooperative, and psychologically that mattered. Not because it indicated guilt, but because it was misunderstood. Jeffrey cried during interviews. He expressed intense emotion. He appeared to know details investigators believed only the killer would know, though many of those details had circulated through media reports and school conversations. Core psychological idea. Here's the assumption that shaped this case. Emotional distress was treated as suspicion. Instead of asking, why is this person upset, they asked, what is he hiding? But innocence often looks different than we expect. Jeffrey's emotional response wasn't guilt. It was grief combined with anxiety. A teenager being questioned about a horrific crime by authority figures he had been taught to trust. Why innocence can look suspicious. Psychologically, innocent people often behave very differently from guilty ones. Guilty individuals tend to be cautious. They anticipate consequences. They manage information carefully. Innocent people often do the opposite. They cooperate, they explain, they volunteer information. Not because they're careless, but because they believe honesty will clear them. Jeffrey believed that cooperating fully would eliminate suspicion. He trusted that the system would recognize the truth if he was transparent enough. He couldn't understand why cooperation seemed to increase suspicion rather than reduce it. The interrogation techniques used against Jeffrey were psychologically intensive and overwhelming for a vulnerable teenager. Investigators conducted multiple lengthy sessions without a parent or attorney present, using structured methods designed to elicit confessions rather than gather open-ended information. Prolonged questioning changes how people think. Under sustained pressure, people don't just answer questions. They try to resolve uncertainty. They try to end suspicion. They try to be believed. During one intense session, investigators falsely told Jeffrey they had evidence proving he was the killer. They suggested that cooperation could help him. They implied that continued denial would only make things worse. Memory, doubt, and breaking point. At one point, investigators suggested that Jeffrey might have committed the crime and blacked it out, a concept sometimes referred to as repressed memory. The idea was implausible, but under pressure, even unlikely possibilities can begin to feel real. Jeffrey began to doubt his own certainty, and once doubt enters the mind, stress fills the gap. This leads to a counterintuitive psychological reality. Innocent people often confess faster than guilty ones, not because they're lying, but because they expect the truth to work in their favor. When that expectation clashes with continued suspicion, stress increases. And under stress, people make decisions aimed at immediate relief rather than long-term outcomes. After hours of interrogation, Jeffrey finally broke. He provided a detailed confession, incorporating information investigators had fed him throughout his interviews. The confession sounded emotional. It sounded sincere. And to many observers, it sounded convincing. But sincerity isn't accuracy, and emotional expression isn't evidence. The confession contained details that contradicted forensic findings. Jeffrey described clothing the victim wasn't wearing. He described actions that couldn't have occurred as described. These errors weren't warnings. They were just overlooked. Years later, DNA evidence conclusively excluded Jeffrey as the perpetrator. Physical evidence doesn't interpret behavior. It doesn't read emotion. It doesn't guess. It simply exists. By the time that evidence emerged, the confession had already shaped the narrative. The system had committed to a story, and psychologically, it was difficult to abandon it. The DNA evidence ultimately identified the real perpetrator, Stephen Cunningham, who later admitted to the crime and provided details only the true killer could know. Once a confession exists, investigations often shift from exploration to explanation. Contradictions stop being warnings and become problems to reconcile. This isn't malicious, it's human. Narratives are hard to abandon once they feel complete. Jeffrey Deskovic spent 16 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. Those years mattered. He entered prison as a teenager and emerged as an adult. His education was interrupted. His relationships were altered. His life trajectory was permanently changed. After his exoneration, Jeffrey worked to rebuild a life that had been taken from him. He later became an advocate for criminal justice reform, seeking to prevent others from experiencing the same fate he did. The broader lesson. We expect guilt to look nervous and evasive. We expect innocence to look calm and consistent. Psychology shows us the opposite often happens. Emotion, cooperation, and openness can be signs of innocence, not guilt. The story of Jeffrey Deskovic teaches us that our instincts about human behavior are often wrong. What looks suspicious may be grief. What feels convincing may be stress. And what seems like honesty can sometimes lead to devastating consequences. Jeffrey believed that truth would protect him. He believed cooperation would clear his name. He believed the system would recognize innocence. He was wrong. Not because he was naive, but because our justice system relies on flawed assumptions about how people behave under pressure. If you're interested in the psychology-based breakdowns of real cases, especially ones where assumptions quietly shape outcomes, consider subscribing. This channel exists to understand how these mistakes happen so they can be recognized and prevented.